Lecture 71, Thomas Hardy.
To begin this lecture, I want to quote from a passage describing an accident. The accident happened soon after a young girl falls asleep while driving a horse and wagon in the middle of the night. Suddenly awakened by a jerk that shakes her out of her seat, she hears a groan. A hollow groan, unlike anything she had ever heard in her life, came from the front, followed by a shout of, "Ho there!" The lantern hanging at her wagon had gone out, but another was shining in her face, much brighter than her own had been. Something terrible had happened. In consternation, Tess jumped down and discovered the dreadful truth. The groan had proceeded from her father's poor horse, Prince, the morning mail cart, with its two noiseless wheels, speeding along these lanes like an arrow, had driven into her slow and unlighted equipage. The pointed shaft of the cart had entered the breast of the unhappy Prince like a sword, and from the wound his life's blood was spouting in a stream and falling with a hiss into the road. In this passage from Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles, first published in 1891, a dreadful accident befalls the heroine in the middle of the night, or rather in the wee small hours of a Saturday morning in May. A lovely girl of about 17, Tess is the eldest child of a shiftless, alcoholic peddler named Jack Durbeyfield. He lives with his wife Joan and their 7 children in a rented cottage in the rural county of South Wessex, a fictional place. Hardy took the name from an ancient region of Britain and fictionally applied it to the modern county of Dorset in southwest England. Now, let's get back to the accident. On the day before it strikes, Jack Durbeyfield learns quite by chance that he may be descended from an old Norman family named d'Urberville, and may therefore have titled ancestors going right back to the 11th century. So Jack decides to celebrate by getting drunk at the local tavern. In consequence, he's good for nothing that night. He cannot drive a load of beehives to the town of Casterbridge in time for the opening of the Saturday market there. At 1:30 in the morning, when Jack's wife awakens Tess to give her this news, Tess insists on driving the horse and wagon herself, with her little brother Abraham to keep her company. But during a long ride behind a snail-like nag that is comically named Prince, Tess and her brother both fall asleep. Just before the accident strikes, Tess is dreaming of a gentlemanly suitor because her parents have put this idea into her head. In particular, her mother thinks that they may all be related to a rich old lady named d'Urberville who lives nearby, that Tess may be able to claim kin on behalf of the family, and that this kinship may lead to a grand marriage for Tess. But the dream of a gentlemanly suitor ends abruptly when Tessa's unguided horse drifts onto the wrong side of the road and is fatally gored by the pointed shaft of a mail cart speeding through the night. It's impossible to overstate the impact of this one dreadful accident. Besides threatening economic disaster for Tess's family, it also prefigures and predetermines the major events of Tess's tragic life. When Thomas Hardy started writing the story of Tess, he was a well-established novelist of 48. With his wife Emma, he occupied a house they had built a few years earlier in the town of Dorchester, in the county of Dorset, his native ground. Like Wordsworth, he spent his life largely in the region of his birth, and he mined that region for his novels. Just as Wordsworth's poetry springs mostly from his experience of the English Lake District in the north, Hardy's fiction mostly originates from his experience of the South. The southwestern counties, Dorset, Somerset, Wiltshire, and Devon, all of them renamed as parts of the fictional region of Wessex. Son of a stonemason, Hardy was schooled in Dorset, started training to be an architect at the age of 16, and at 22 went to work for a London firm that kept him busy restoring Gothic churches. But his heart never left the rural life of Dorset, and after writing poems about it that failed to get into print, he tried writing novels about it. In just a few years, he hit pay dirt. By 1883, the great success of novels such as Far from the Madding Crowd enabled Hardy and his wife to build their own house in the town of Dorchester, where he started writing Tess in 1888. Like the novels of Dickens, like Flaubert's Madame Bovary, and like many of Hardy's own previous books, Tess was serialized in a magazine before it first appeared as a book in December 1891. At that time, Hardy gave the book its provocative subtitle, A Pure Woman. 20 years later, in his preface to the 1912 edition of Tess, Hardy wrote that he had added the subtitle at the last moment, after reading the final proofs, as being the estimate left in a candid mind of the heroine's character, an estimate nobody would be likely to dispute. But it was, he added, more disputed than anything else in the book. And no wonder. Tess is hardly pure in a conventional sense. Early on, she loses her virginity to a man she does not love, and though she later marries another man, she eventually becomes the mistress of the first until she murders him. How can such a woman be pure? The beginning of an answer to this question lies in the accident that kills Prince, the Durbeyfield family horse. Let's finger again the chain of events leading up to this accident. The horse is fatally gored because Tess falls asleep while driving the horse and fails to see the mail cart coming. She falls asleep because she's been roused from her bed at 1:30 in the morning to make a night journey that should have been made by her father. But he couldn't do it because he was drunk after celebrating the glorious ancestry that he accidentally discovered earlier in the day. Thus, by an unbroken chain of causes, one accident leads to another. The world of Hardy's fiction is governed not by the benevolence of divine providence, but by chance, the cruel indifference of fate. Horses die in the middle of the night, and poor families face the prospect of ruin because fate decrees that they must. By the time he wrote Tess, Hardy's vision of the world had darkened into a deep pessimism. So this is a tragic novel, a novel whose only real light radiates from the character of Tess herself. In a family headed by parents who drink to drown their troubles and who trust in blind luck to save them, Tess personifies self-respect and self-reliance. It isn't fate alone that puts her one night on the road to disaster. Bravely assuming the responsibility that her father shirks, Tess insists on driving the horse herself because she cannot bear to ask the help of a neighbor, cannot bear the shame of having to admit that her father is too drunk to go himself. Thus, the real cause of the night's disaster is not fate, but the fateful interaction of Jack Durbeyfield's shiftlessness with his daughter's sense of responsibility. We see this again when the horse is killed, for Tess insists on taking all the blame herself. So in the opening chapters of the novel, Tess begins to assume the stature of a tragic heroine. At the very least, she is pure in her devotion to her family and its needs, in her willingness to risk on their behalf the dangers of a night on the road. At the same time, we begin to see in the life of Tess yet another version of the Cinderella story. In Dickens' Great Expectations, we've seen that Pip becomes a male Cinderella. When this grimy stepson of a blacksmith is suddenly told that he's destined to inherit great wealth, he instantly imagines that he's destined to marry the beautiful Estella. Likewise, Tess has been told that because of her suddenly discovered ancestry, she may be destined to marry a gentleman or nobleman. But consider this fairy tale expectation in light of the accident. The only man in Tess's life right now is a nag named Prince, who is bleeding to death on a public road, pierced by the sword-like shaft of the mail cart. As a nag with a comically pretentious name, Prince could no more protect this lady in distress than she could protect him. And this fatal goring of a horse during a night ride in which Tess falls asleep prefigures the sexual penetration of Tess herself. She is violated in her sleep during a night journey in which Alec d'Urberville leads her into a dark forest where she falls asleep. Like the accident that kills the horse, the loss of her virginity springs from the irresponsibility of her parents. After learning of their supposed nobility and of an old lady named d'Urberville who lives nearby, They insist that Tess go and visit her in order to claim kin. Notice, by the way, how different they are from the parents of the Bennet girls in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. In Austen's novel, Mr. Bennet has to call on the new bachelor in the neighborhood before any of his daughters can meet him. But the Durbeyfields send their daughter off to somebody they've never met at all. And when Tess comes home to report that she's met only young Alec, they urge her to go back again in hopes that he will marry her. And if he don't marry her afore, says her mother after she leaves, he will after, for that he's all afire with love for her any eye can see. Afore and after here, of course, mean before and after sex. In hopes of promoting a marriage with Alec, Tess's mother virtually throws her at him. Alec is a sham aristocrat. Son of a deceased merchant named Stoke, who simply annexed the name of D'Urberville to his own, he lives with his widowed mother on a smart new country estate. He's a bold, swarthy man of about 34 with a handlebar mustache and an insidious charm that makes Tess nervous. Unlike her mother, Tess has no designs on Alec. But she's been told that his mother wants her to manage the poultry on their farm. So she returns to the farm only because she hopes to earn some money and thus make amends for the death of the horse. Once again, her motive is purely good. Nevertheless, her return to Alec leads to the loss of her virginity and thus provokes a major question. How can a sexually experienced single woman be considered pure? Some critics have answered this question by arguing that Tess is the victim of rape. If, they say, she gives absolutely no consent to the loss of her virginity, she cannot be held responsible for the loss and thus remains innocent, morally pure. But in my view, this way of defining the purity of Tess seriously oversimplifies her character. Though Hardy nowhere describes precisely what Alec does to her, partly because no Victorian novelist could be so explicit, he makes it perfectly clear that Tess is seduced, that she yields to sexual temptation. Hardy's heroine walks a fine line between purity and lust, and he took special pains to place her right on that line. In the first published version of the novel, the serial version of 1891, Alec concocts a fake marriage to Tess, and she leaves him as soon as she finds out that he's tricked her. In the first book version, Alec drugs her before making his move. Both of these stratagems leave Tess absolutely blameless. But at the deliberate risk of complicating Tess's purity, Hardy cut both the mock marriage and the drugging from the 1892 edition of Tess, and thereby sought to show that Tess was victimized by what he called in a letter, seduction pure and simple. Insofar as seduction can ever be pure and simple. That's what he said. And in the novel itself, at the end of chapter 44, Tess explicitly recognizes Alec as, quote, her seducer, unquote. By itself, this epithet for Alec hardly disentangles seduction from rape or proves that Tess was victimized by seduction pure and simple, in Hardy's phrase. But it does tell us clearly what Tess felt and thought at the sight of Alec, and it confirms what goes through her mind as she mentally reviews her experience with him right after she leaves her job at his house. According to Catherine MacKinnon, who specializes in feminism and jurisprudence, the feminist distinction between rape and intercourse lies in the meaning of the act from women's point of view, close quote. Very well. Here's the way Tess herself views her experience with Alec, narrator writing about her thoughts in the third person. She had never wholly cared for him, nor did she care for him now. She had dreaded him, winced before him, succumbed to adroit advantages he took of her helplessness. Then, temporarily blinded by his ardent manners, had been stirred to confused surrender a while, had suddenly despised and disliked him and run away. That was all. Temporarily blinded by his ardent manners, Tess had been stirred to confused surrender a while. This is Tess's own way of recalling her response to Alec's advances. Because Tess never wholly loved Alec, some critics seem to assume that she could never in any way have consented to his sexual advances. But can we really assume that no pure woman can be sexually aroused by a man she does not love? Hardy shows what even a pure woman will do under particular conditions. She not only yields to Alec during their night journey, she also lives with him for some weeks afterward until she decides to run away and bear the child that he has given her. Like Eve in the book of Genesis, Tess is the victim of diabolic temptation. Her very first meeting with Alec recalls the temptation of Eve. When Alec shows Tess the fruit garden at Trantridge, the d'Urberville house, he offers her strawberries, holding a particularly fine one to her mouth by its stem. "No, no," she said quickly, putting her fingers between his hand and her lips. "I would rather take it in my own hand." "Nonsense," he insisted. And in a slight distress, she parted her lips and took it in. Just as Satan overcomes the resistance of Eve in the Garden of Eden, Alec overcomes the resistance of Tess. Of course, Tess has not been forbidden to eat strawberries, and she says herself that she would like to take one in her own hand. But she ends up letting Alec feed it to her. And, quote, "in a slight distress, she parted her lips and took it in," unquote. Notice her ambivalence here. Though slightly distressed, she actively parts her lips and takes the strawberry in. If the violent and fatal wounding of Prince can be read as prefiguring rape, Tessa's opening of her lips to a strawberry can just as plausibly be read as prefiguring her confused surrender to the pleasures of sex. Half pleased and half reluctant, we are told, Tess dreamily consumes whatever Alec feeds her. This whole episode shows that Tess, like Eve, can be tempted. But if Hardy recalls the book of Genesis in this novel, he also radically rewrites it. For only after Tess falls to temptation does she meet her Adam, the noble, handsome, thoroughly respectable man who falls in love with her and wants to marry her, but then rejects her as soon as he learns her sexual history. Though Tess yearns to forget this history and start life anew, Alec's seduction of her leaves her indelibly marked. Marked by the knowledge that she has been sexually exploited, marked by the pain of childbirth, marked by the memory of sorrow when her baby dies. The memory of her experience stalks her wherever she goes, even when she takes a job on a dairy farm that is far away from her house and meets a man who truly loves her, namely Angel Clare. Though she has resolved to marry no one after what has happened to her, Angel's passion finally breaks down her resistance. Then, torn between her impulse to tell him everything about her past and her fear of losing him if she does so, she finally agrees to marry him without telling him her sexual history until their wedding night. At this point, he leaves her. Without consummating their marriage, he leaves for an indefinite sojourn in Brazil, and with only vague assurances that he may one day return to her. So what can she do? Though she still loves Angel and believes he will return to her, she is now a virtually abandoned wife. Left with 50 pounds, half of which she gives to her mother, she goes to work hacking up turnips at a wretched farm called Flintcomb Ash, a starve-acre place, as Tess's friend Marion calls it. And hacking up turnips in frost and driving rainstorms is back-breaking work, far worse than milking cows at the green, sunny, romantic dairy farm. As Tess and Marion fondly remember the dairy farm, we see again how Hardy evokes the book of Genesis. Just as Adam and Eve are expelled from Eden to earn their living out of the thorny ground by the sweat of their brows, so Tess is expelled from her marriage and made to earn her living by the hardest possible labor on a desolate farm. Tess is something radically new in English fiction. Though she's hardly the first heroine who has to worry about money, she's a far cry from Elizabeth Bennet, the heroine of Pride and Prejudice. Tess is the first English heroine who earns her own money by hard labor in a field. Yet the diabolical tempter will not let her alone. stalking her relentlessly, Alec plays a variety of roles, including preacher, lowly laborer, and even Satan himself, a role he jestingly assumes. But the most seductive role of all that he plays is that of rescuer. You see, Alec reverses the roles of villain and hero. Angel is supposed to be the hero, the good man who marries Tess. But because of his hard, literal, rigid, unyielding conception of female purity, he has abandoned his wife. Alec is supposedly the villain, the seducer, the exploiter, but it's he who keeps offering to help Tess and her family if she will only forget about the invisible man she calls a husband and return to Alec. Invisible is what Alec calls Tess's husband. To read Alec as a rapist, you see, is to underestimate him. Like Satan, he seeks not to pinion the body of his victim, but to master her mind, to exploit her weaknesses, to take, as Tess herself thinks, adroit advantage of her helplessness. Why does she finally agree to return to Alec, to live with him again? Not because she craves the excitement of having a lover, as Emma Bovary does, not because she cannot endure the hardship of laboring in the fields, or even the torture of relentlessly feeding stalks of wheat to a threshing machine, and not because Alec physically compels her to come back to him. She relents only because Alec uses what she calls his cruel persuasion on her, taunting her about the very existence of her long-absent husband. He finally breaks her faith in Angel's return, tempting her with the promise of help for her desperately needy mother and siblings. After her father dies, he finally breaks her resistance to him. In her own words to Angel, who at last returns, Alec won her back to him. So what does this tell us about Tess? That she's impure, or that she's purely determined to do whatever she must to help her poor family? It was the second motive, the altruistic motive, that led her to Alec in the first place. But this motive can hardly explain or justify what she does when Angel finally comes back to her from his sojourn in Brazil, physically drained but mentally revived, ready to love and live with Tess no matter what she has done. What she does right after Angel's return challenges his newfound devotion to her as much as it challenges our faith in her purity. For when she sees Angel again and suddenly realizes that Alec has lied to her about his disappearance, about her husband's disappearance, she murders Alec. In light of this startling fact, along with the fact that she twice chooses to live with Alec as his mistress, how can we call her a pure woman, as Hardy does in the subtitle to this book? Well, consider what the novel says of her just after she has buried her baby. Almost at a leap, we are told, Tess changed from simple girl to complex woman. Symbols of reflectiveness passed into her face, and a note of tragedy into her voice. A complex woman cannot be pure in the scientific sense because she is no longer simple, homogeneous, unmixed. She is rather good in the sense that Aristotle means when he says that the protagonist of a tragedy must be good. But according to Aristotle, the virtue of a tragic character cannot be absolute and unassailable. For the passage of such a character from good fortune to bad would then be simply odious to us. Okay. Is it simply odious that Tess should be executed for her crime? Just at the end of the novel, we are grimly told, quote, justice was done, and the president of the immortals, in Aeschylean phrase, had ended his sport with Tess. So is justice purely wanton, arbitrary, and sadistic here? Or does Tess bear some responsibility for her fate even while remaining good and pure? Whatever the answer to this question, she cannot assume the status of a tragic heroine without also assuming responsibility. You can't separate the two. The cause of the fall of a tragic character, says Aristotle, must lie within himself, not in any depravity, but in some great fault on his part, or her part, he might have said. Tess dies for committing a murder that cannot be explained or justified by self-defense or by the threat of rape, since she kills the very man who persuaded her to be his mistress, the man who won her back to him. With the possible exception of a plea of insanity, no defense of Tess in a court of law could possibly succeed. In strict legal terms, she is guilty of murder. Yet by now, in our reading of the novel, we have been made to feel something of what Angel feels when she tells him of the murder. He feels, we are told, horror at her impulse, mixed with amazement at the strength of her affection for himself, at the strangeness of its quality, which had apparently extinguished her moral sense altogether. As well as his confused and excited ideas could reason, he supposed that her mind had lost its balance and plunged her into this abyss. Still partly entangled in the nets of conventional rationality, even as he vows to protect Tess lovingly from here on, Angel can only conclude that Tess has gone mad. But Tess is not mad. Tess is not mad. She is not insane. She kills Alec because in seducing her a second time, he threatens to make her his creature, as she once said to him. He threatens to take possession of her soul. Have no fear, said Christ to the apostles. Have no fear of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. You had better be afraid of one who can destroy both soul and body. Alec d'Urberville is such a one. As I have said already, to see him as a rapist is to underestimate him. He's far more dangerous and diabolical as a seducer, and that is what finally goads Tess to strike him down. Painful experience has taught her that as long as Alec lives, she can never escape him. He will haunt and hound and bully and bribe her until she surrenders yet again and thus becomes again his mistress, his possession, his creature. In Tess's eyes, the only way she can free herself is to kill him. In killing Alec, Tess acts on desperate impulse. Long before it is precisely her own impulse, cunningly manipulated by Alec, that prompts her to ride with him on the night in which he leads her into the woods and takes her virginity. Traveling back from town one Saturday night with a group of women, she is physically threatened by one of them, who jealously resents her becoming Alec's new favorite, and she is then reviled by various others. Into this crisis rides Alec, would-be rescuer of a lady in distress, taking adroit advantage of her helplessness, as Tess later reflects. He urges her to jump up behind him, an invitation she would have declined, quote, at almost any other moment of her life. But coming as the invitation did at the particular juncture, when fear and indignation at these adversaries could be transformed by a spring of the foot into a triumph over them, she abandoned herself to her impulse, climbed the gate, put her toe upon his instep, and scrambled into the saddle beside him. Strangely enough, one critic of this novel says that to preserve Tess's purity, Hardy must insist on her passivity. But here, as in the strawberry-eating episode, Hardy insists on her activity. He uses a string of active verbs: abandoned, climbed, put, scrambled. Tess is not seized by Alec, definitely not raped, rapta in the root sense of the word. Instead, she makes her own moves. The active verbs express what she impulsively does to elude and thus triumph over the other women. Laughing scornfully at the departing Tess, the others know how illusory her triumph is and how fateful her impulse will prove to be. Having provoked this impulse, Alec soon provokes another that all but liquefies her resistance to him. When they get lost in the dark, foggy woods at 1 a.m, which is exactly what Alec intended, she calls him treacherous and demands to be set down from his horse so that she can walk home at once. Pleading for time to find out where they are, Alec makes a nest for her in the leaves and then casually reveals that he has just given her father a new horse. "Oh, how very good of you that is," she says. She cannot check her own impulse to thank him, for he has suddenly lifted the burden of guilt that she has borne ever since she led the family horse into disaster. And so, exhausted by the labors and walking and quarreling of a day that began at 5 a.m, Tess falls asleep in the knowledge that she is deeply indebted to Alec who knows exactly how to stir and exploit her impulses. We never learn precisely how Tess responds to Alec's sexual advances, but in my judgment, we cannot salvage her purity simply by claiming that she was raped. Those who make this claim must explain why she chooses to stay with Alec for 3 weeks after their first sexual experience, why she remembers being stirred to confused surrender by him, and why he eventually wins her back. Critics who believe that a pure Tess cannot have been seduced must also explain how a purity that can be tainted by seduction can somehow remain untainted by murder. I believe that her purity withstands both murder and seduction. Tess kills Alec to free herself from a man whose diabolic manipulation of her motives and impulses has twice threatened to make her his creature, to take possession of her soul. Only in grasping this point do we begin to grasp the complexity of this tragic heroine and begin to see why Hardy calls her a pure woman.